Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is the UK in crisis after a series of deadly terrorist attacks, a hung parliament, and the horrific human tragedy of the Grenfell Tower, as well as the burning issue of Brexit? Many are asking if the ruling elites are out of touch. Crosstalk in the UK, I'm joined by my guest, Steve Keen in London. He is a professor of economics at Kingston University, London, as well as the economic advisor to Asymmetric Return Capital. Also in London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Salford, we cross to Stephen Fielding. He is a professor of political history at the University of Nottingham. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Steve, let me go to you first in London. I pose a very simple question at the top of this program. Is the UK in crisis? And maybe explain why. Go ahead.
I think it is in crisis because what's really, we're at a turning point where the UK was where neoliberalism was born. Maggie Thatcher and her little handbag carrying around a copy of Hayek's Freedom book really set the tone, and that was advertising this is going to be a tough new world where tough love is going to be the rule. And the basic perspective, I think, was always that it's a bit like castor oil used to be regarded. It tastes bad, but it's good for you, and when you grow up, you'll appreciate it. Well, they've had 30 years of this now. It tasted bad. Its effect has been bad. You can no longer say this is what will happen when we apply it. They're now living what has happened through applying neoliberalism, and it hasn't been successful. The UK has gone backwards in international comparisons, reduced its manufacturing sector, and now the public has really said they've had enough and they're going in the opposite direction because they've finally been presented with somebody who's willing to offer that opposite direction.
And that is? And that
Jeremy Corbyn.
Okay, we'll get back to him. Marcus, same question here, but maybe if I can add to it here, there seems to be a crisis of leadership here. We have the parliamentary election outcome, but we still have the same leadership, and there doesn't seem to be any introspection why the Tories underperformed the way they did. Kind of reminds me of the Democrats in America. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, first of all, Britain is being plagued by numerous crises. Theresa May, while she's an incredibly hard-working person, she's an incredibly shy person. She's incredibly awkward. She's incredibly uncomfortable with ordinary people. And that is simply not good enough if she wants to be Prime Minister. And there are numerous ills plaguing Britain, politically, economically, and in terms of security. We have a Conservative Party which has been running the country since 2010 and puts its interests before the country, hence why the Conservatives held the EU referendum, hence why they called the snap general election, and hence why they are trying to form an agreement with the DUP in Northern Ireland, which could jeopardise the peace process there. And then we have the terrible situation of how there are 7 million British people living in poverty, 4 million of which are children. We have over 1 million people in Britain dependent on food banks. And then we have the severe challenge to British national security from within, which stems partly from there being a very serious problem within the Muslim community in the UK. But that problem in the Muslim community in the UK is fuelled by UK foreign policy, fuelled by how Britain has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is the leading exporter of extremism to the world and terrorism, Wahhabism, and also because of how the British government is supporting the numerous Islamist Wahhabist terrorist groups in Syria. And let's not forget, Peter, the recent terrorist attacks in Britain, Westminster, Manchester, London Bridge, Borough Market, the root of that was Wahhabism. And how does the British government respond? They simply keep on allowing Saudi Arabia to establish Wahhabi mosques in Britain and to establish Wahhabi schools, which are promoting hatred and promoting death to anyone that does not follow Islam. That is an intolerable situation to be in.
I agree with you. Stephen, let me go to you, because you would think about, when it comes to security, that the current Prime Minister, she was the former Home Secretary. She should know the situation better than anyone else in the country. And I have to say, at least an outsider looking in, she looks helpless and hapless. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, as has already been said, Theresa May has proven to be an appalling political leader. During the election campaign, she was claiming right at the start she was strong and stable, and she called on the British electorate to vote for her on that basis to take Britain through the Brexit negotiations. And of course, that all fell apart, largely due to her own incompetent handling of her manifesto, which worried a lot of people about the dementia tax and actually reinforced many concerns people had about austerity. And during that campaign, there were, of course, some terrorist incidents to which she did not really respond in a particularly comforting leadership kind of a way. People want to be reassured at moments such as that. But the problem with terror, if that's one of the elements of this British crisis, and I must admit, I do kind of dispute that term as a general description of what's going on. The terror incidents that have occurred since Westminster Bridge up to the present day, in fact, there are two different elements. There's the kind of lone wolf, the person who is clearly somewhat disturbed with a van, and I'm not quite sure what security services can do about individuals such as that. But also there are the other two incidents in Manchester and in London that did clearly seem to be part of a network. And unfortunately, however much the security services attempt to counteract some of those plots, like the IRA said, and Britain has been through this before, like the IRA said in the 70s and 80s, they only need to succeed once, and the security services have to succeed all the time. And unfortunately, they did not succeed on these two occasions.
Okay, but Steve, go ahead, jump.
One of the big falling points in the campaign was when May, of course, was Home Secretary for the last 5 years. She oversaw the austerity-driven program, which actually cut back the number of community police dramatically. I think about 20,000 less police than there were 5 years ago. And one of them, there was this famous video where the winner of the Community Policeman of the Year award in 2010 berated May for the damage of taking away the community policing, saying we can no longer be preemptive. We can no longer find out who is likely to do something like this. There will be a terrorist attack. And of course, there she was being shown on TV during the campaign saying, you're scaremongering.
Okay, well, Marcus, you know, then what do you need the national security state for? I'm sorry, that is not good enough. Go ahead, Marcus.
Look, Peter, the problems with Theresa May did not begin when she became Prime Minister. The evidence of her inadequacies as a politician and as a leader were very, very evident when she was Home Secretary. I can tell you now, as a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, the only time I saw her leave the Home Office building, which for viewers outside of Britain is the equivalent of the Interior Ministry, was when she would come to the Commons, the House of Commons, to speak from the dispatch box. She would rarely leave the Home Office building because she is incredibly shy. She does not like meeting people. And what does this demonstrate? Well, it demonstrates she's totally unsuitable to become Prime Minister, but it also demonstrates something else, which I've been saying for some years now. The calibre in British politics is very, very low. And when the calibre is low, that opens the doors to people who are weak and who are inadequate. And I will say the same about Boris Johnson. If I was a Conservative Party supporter, member, I would not want Boris Johnson as my leader. But the question for the Tories is this: who else is there to succeed Theresa May?
Okay, Stephen, let's talk about. You want to jump in and react to that? Go ahead. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, it's one of the old kind of sayings. You know, people who are living through politics at any particular moment always bemoan the appalling leadership that they lived through and look back to a golden age. I'm afraid the golden age really didn't exist. Some of Britain's leaders have been appalling in the past, as well as pretty poor now. But I think it's interesting. We haven't really talked about Brexit, because when you talk about a crisis is a moment of decision. It's kind of from medicine. It's a moment at which the patient either dies or either gets better. water. And Britain has been living through a kind of crisis ever since the British people, 48 to 52, decided to leave the EU. And this week, the recent times, Britain has started the Brexit negotiations. And we don't know how those are going to end. And so we've got a febrile kind of political state at the moment. This is a kind of a political crisis, but also interlocks certain economic concerns, because we don't know what the economic consequences of Brexit will be. And the real political element of the crisis is that Theresa May wanted to get a majority and she found herself with a minority, but that Brexit goes through both the two main parties. The Conservatives are divided over what they should do about Brexit, and the Labour Party is divided about what it should do about Brexit. So it's not so much about the individuals concerned. There's a structural problem with political leadership at the moment in regard to Brexit, the most important subject that Britain has confronted in many, many generations.
That's a really good point. Steve, if I could go to you in London again.
Yeah.
But given this important moment here, is the current Prime Minister competent to deal with what the British electorate wanted? A hard Brexit, or is it going to be just this wishy-washy stuff from both parties? Go ahead, Steve.
Absolutely not. I mean, what you need, and this has been shown by Yanis Varoufakis' experience with being in the team negotiating for Greece against the European Union, they play hardball. The financial ministers of the European Union wanted to make an example of Greece, and that's exactly what they did. They behaved in a very coordinated way. They intimidated and bullied all the way through. And it showed you need somebody who's got the capacity to say no. Now, Theresa May has got the capacity to say whatever her public relations person said she should say at the time, which of course failed abjectly during the campaign. Jeremy Corbyn has a reputation of crossing the floor and voting against his own party, I think on 600 occasions, roughly, when he was in Parliament. And you need somebody like that leading it who's capable to say to somebody like Schäuble, no, I'm not going to agree to that until we work out doing all these negotiations in parallel. We're not going to do it. So I think this is a case where the only person who's got the leadership capacity is Jeremy Corbyn.
I have to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on what's happening in the UK. Stay with RT.
That Trump could get elected with a series of lies and distortions is a reflection of the fact that the voting public could be convinced by that. And what we really need to do, and one of the reasons as a scientist I'm interested in this, is we really need to get people to apply the same standards to politics that apply to science: skeptical inquiry, empirical testing, and demand evidence for what your politicians tell you.
The subprime market was reformed to some degree, and the Wall Street cockroaches were unable to penetrate that market as they once did. So the Wall Street cockroaches, along with their brothers and sisters in the City of London, had to get into the economy another route. They found the car loan racket, and it turned into $1 trillion car accident, because those cockroaches are never told to stop. There's nobody in the Justice Department has a can of Raid to spray on Jamie Dimon, the cockroach.
Let's talk about blackness and the blues of being black. And all was well in the big house. I don't know, at least that's what I've been told. But it was simply that way and remains as such because we simply forgot our goals. Seeing we've allowed them to rearrange our plans, they've taught us the sickness of trusting our enemy, and we became their fans. That's what I call a lack of blackness, or understanding the blues of being black. You see, the blues of being black should mandate that we attack, knowing how, when, and what to do should come as simple and as natural as being black and simply tired of feeling blue. That's black and blue.
Love, always.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing what's happening in the UK. Okay, let me go back to Stephen in Salford. You were, I think, chuckling at the very end of the first segment there. Why? Go ahead.
Well, I think that the idea that Jeremy Corbyn has spent all of his career basically voting against the leadership of his own party makes him ideally suited to lead negotiations. Rather strange. Jeremy Corbyn is a great campaigner. He proved that twice when he got elected and re-elected leader, when he brought the Conservative lead down from 20 points to just 2 points. But he is a terrible party manager. He's still faced with a parliamentary party that 80% of whom, roughly, still don't have very much faith in him. And he's leading a party that is almost fatally divided over Brexit. One reason why Labour did so well in this election is because it basically got lots of young people to vote for it and lots of Remain voters to vote for it. And yet, at the same time, the party is committed to leaving the single market. So there's a fatal contradiction within the Labour Party on that matter. It has to resolve it and does not wish to at this moment in time. The reason why the Conservatives are in trouble is because they've also got similar contradictions.
Okay, I want to go to Marcus. Let me go to Marcus. Okay, you can jump in later, Steve. Go ahead, Marcus. You want to I mean, I expected to have a long talk about Brexit here, and I know your position on it. Where do you fit between our two, Steve and Stephen? Go ahead.
No, I disagree with a lot of what was just said about Jeremy Corbyn. I've known Jeremy for some years now, and I am full of admiration for the man. He has never changed his positions. He will not compromise his principles. That man was elected at the June 1983 general election. The first time he sat on the front bench in the House of Commons was after he became leader in September 2015. Why was that? Because he would not change his views to be in line with the Labour leadership. That says a great thing about this man. And also, he's as tough as steel. He's as tough as steel. In the 2 years of his leadership, he has withstood a terrible, disgusting personal attack from right-wing mainstream media, naturally from the Conservative Party, and from the Blairites and the Brownites from within the Parliamentary Labour Party. And you know what? Jeremy is still standing, and he is standing tall today. And let me tell you something about Brexit as well. Jeremy has said Britain is leaving the European Union. No question about it, but he has said that the agreement that Britain reaches with the EU must be in the interests of UK industry, must be in the interests of the UK economy. It is simply unacceptable for the Conservatives to approach the negotiations with Brussels with a jingoistic attitude, because that's what many of them, that's why many of them dislike the EU. It's a matter of jingoism. And people like Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, these people are millionaires. They don't care if it doesn't work for the UK economy. But Jeremy, if he becomes Prime Minister, either the next general election or if the agreement with the DUP doesn't work out for the Tories, Jeremy will be a very, very tough negotiator, and he will ensure the best deal for the British economy. The amount of Chinese, Indian and Japanese diplomats who tell me that Britain is a bridge for them to re-export their goods into Europe without paying tariffs. And they say if that bridge isn't there anymore, what is the point of there being Japanese factories, for example, in the north of England? They will simply relocate them to Europe. That is something that Jeremy understands. That is something, quite frankly, the Tories do not understand, and they don't care about. And Theresa May is pandering to the hard right of her party against the interests of Britain.
Okay, Steve, explain something to me and our international audience here. You know, we have this leader of Labour and espousing ideas that a lot of people thought, well, that was like 30 years ago and it didn't work, and that's what people rejected with the rise of like Margaret Thatcher. I mean, is it millennial? The millennials are saying this here. I mean, it's a mantra in the mainstream media that this is socialism. It doesn't work, and you hear this over and over again. And I read the manifesto. I was really quite surprised, and I was really quite surprised by how much people took an interest in this guy that has been around for a long time. He used to come on RT all the time on a regular basis, just MP from London here. Steve, explain it to us. What is it? In London? Explain it how this phenomenon works, because it does. Go ahead.
The reason that neoliberalism appeared to work, and I've explained this in my new book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, is that what Maggie Thatcher unleashed was the financial sector, not the manufacturing sector of Britain. And from when she was in office until when the crisis occurred in 2010, of course with Blair being part of that as well, the level of private debt in Britain rose from 55% of GDP to 195% of GDP. Now, it was that incredible increase in finance and credit that gave you what looked like a successful economy for the whole period, but it was based on just selling more and more private debt. When the steam ran out of that in 2010, the wheels fell off what was left of the British economy. Now, at the beginning of that whole thing, Jeremy was a sceptic because he was critical of the finance sector. At the end of it, he's a skeptic because he's critical of the finance sector. He was right in the beginning. It was only because of the growth in debt that the system appeared to work for that period of time. So it isn't a case he's arguing for socialism in the classic old Soviet central planning sense. He's arguing for democratic socialism, which means focusing upon the needs of the people in terms of making sure that there's not a growth of poverty, that the wealth is both created and distributed. That's been completely ignored by the Tories. They're now reaping the whirlwind of that. So Jeremy Corbyn was correct but overwhelmed by credit. Now he's correct and credit is not there anymore.
Okay, Marcus, one of the things when I look at the new Labour, I suppose, is I wouldn't say it's left and right. I think that continuum is really in the past here. What I see him doing is galvanizing people. Participation is what he is really calling for, and people are reacting to it. I think that's really quite interesting, because you see the phenomenon. If you agree or disagree, Trump did galvanize a base to act. Okay, if you agree or disagree with him, he did promote a democratic process. I think the elites take for granted. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I mean, there's you can't make any comparison between Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn.
Sorry.
But look, people in Britain are drawn to Jeremy for a number of reasons. On a personal level, he is a very honest, decent, compassionate human being. He is very approachable. There is no pretense with him whatsoever, unlike what we saw from Thatcher and Tony Blair and David Cameron and, of course, Theresa May. And Jeremy has no problem whatsoever in meeting ordinary people up and down the country. But also, people are drawn to him because of his politics. For example, renationalising the trains, renationalising energy, renationalising water, renationalising Royal Mail. Do you know, Peter, so many ordinary British families are struggling every single day because of these dreadful costs in, for example, the train fares and when it comes to gas. Old people in Britain, Peter, are terrified in the autumn and winter months to turn on their central heating system out of fear they won't be able to pay the bill. Many of them become ill, they go into hospital, some of them actually die. Now, what Jeremy proposed really struck a chord with millions upon millions of people in Britain. And it is so refreshing that we have someone like him, someone who is with the ordinary people in Britain. And also his foreign policy is so different to the Conservatives and also to previous Labour leaders. He's made it very clear that under his leadership, Britain will not walk hand in hand with Trump and America. Britain will no longer invade and bomb other countries. He's made it very clear he wants a complete overhaul of Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia. It was Jeremy who brought up Saudi Arabia and its links to extremism and terrorism during the general election campaign. That has never happened before in British politics. We should be rejoicing.
Okay, let me go to Stephen here. Stephen, let's say Corbyn became Prime Minister. Would what we now is popularly called the deep state let him rule? Would he be just undercut left and right, like what's happening across the pond in Washington, D.C.? You know what I'm getting at. Go ahead, Stephen.
I do, yeah. Well, it's unlikely that he will become Prime Minister, certainly without another general election. There has to be another general election. That Labour just doesn't have enough seats. There aren't enough seats to put together to form a coalition. So that's not going to happen without another election. And with another election, I think some of the paradoxes and the contradictions within Jeremy Corbyn's appeal may unravel if the Conservatives get a new leader with a different approach. But yes, it's always the fear amongst the left. When Tony Benn in the 1980s was riding high, there was always the fear that things would go awry if there was ever a left Labour government. We don't know that would have happened because that never happened. So I don't know. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, there's a lot of fear. There were a lot of fears about him, about his links, calling Hamas friends and distorted quotes such as that. But he really, at the base of it, is basically a left-wing social democrat. I think he's pretty harmless, but that doesn't mean the security services won't look upon him as being a threat. But I don't know. I mean, I know lots of political fiction. I know lots of conspiracy dramas, but I would doubt very much whether we'd see a very British coup if Jeremy Corbyn is elected Prime Minister. But I do think that's actually still quite unlikely.
Okay, let me go back to Steve in London. Steve, I mean, I think in the broadest picture, in the last minute we have in this program here, is that you have these neoliberal economic policies and you have this adventurous foreign policy, and it's called a perfect storm. And this is what is also happening in the political system in Britain, is that there's a rejection of both simultaneously. Go ahead, Steve.
I agree, and this is also, remember, the reason that we're talking about Brexit is because the ordo-liberal philosophy that really shaped the European Union has been a failure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to leave that particular institution. Neoliberalism here has been a failure, and I think there's a realisation inside that so-called deep state that a lot of the policies which have been followed have failed, and they themselves, I think, are looking for something as an alternative. Certainly that's what I know inside the Bank of England and the Treasury. So the opposition that Trump is facing for actually breaking the rule of law, I don't think Corbyn will necessarily face that in the UK.
Gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We've run out of time. I'm very happy that UK politics are interesting again. Many thanks to my guests in London and Salford, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.